the thing that took my interest today is there's been a report issued in the last 24 hours from the HS2, which is the high-speed rail network here in the UK, about the fact that they've been carrying out some tests, side-by-side tests of various types of fuels, so red diesel with additives. Yeah, so they've issued this report on the fact that they've been trying alternative fuels, because obviously here in the UK we're just a matter of months now from losing red diesel as as our preferred fuel of choice. So there's been lots of work done on HVO fuels and hydrogen, electric, and various other bits and pieces. And one of the things that struck me about this press release from HS2 Limited is that one of the people mentioned in it is a guy called Neil Waite. He is head of environmental sciences at HS2 Limited. And it struck me as just how many projects are big enough and important enough to actually have not just a head of environmental sciences, but my assumption is he is probably head of a department. So it's not just one person, it's an entire department devoted to environmental sciences. And I guess that reflects where we are today. The environment obviously is a key concern. Lots of protests and speeches and what have you going on about all things environmental as we speak. So no great surprise the fact that HS2 is focused on all things environmental. But just to give you a very quick recap, I've been writing about and talking about construction and construction equipment, demolition equipment for 33 odd years. So during my time here in the UK, I have seen, visited, reported on, I've lost count of how many major projects. I guess the one that really sticks in my mind as one of the early ones was the construction of the Channel Tunnel. And I came to the Channel Tunnel so early on that I actually went out on one of the rigs that was doing a test boring in the channel to make sure that the rock was stable enough to actually take the tunnel when it was finally built. So I was in there very, very early days. I guess I also caught the very, very tail end of the construction of the M25, which is a circular motorway that encompasses the whole of London. So that was a major project as well. And then more recently, I guess we've had the London 2012 Olympics and the preparations for that. And we've also had Crossrail, which is, I think, still ongoing. And now we are going into HS2. And the one thing they've all had in common, I think, is the fact that they've all been used in one way or another to move the industry goalposts, to move us on to perhaps another level. The one, I guess, that sticks in my mind was on the London 2012 Olympics, and the fact that a lot of the sites that were run as part of the preparation for the London Olympics, there was an insistence on the fact that the equipment that was used on those sites was in some way protected against theft. We had seen a lot of plant theft. We still continue to see a lot of plant theft here in the UK. But the London 2012 Olympics, or the build up towards it and the preparations for it, was used to encourage specifically rental companies and plant hirers to equip their equipment with anti-theft devices, so tracking devices, anti-theft locks, covert marking, and all the things that we know about. Some of that carried forward, I think, to Crossrail, and Crossrail also took on board, I think that was sort of late stages of stage 3B emissions and over into stage 4, so there was a great deal of work done on that. And obviously we're now into stage 5, and things like the HS2 project are now focused on stage 5 and even beyond, so looking at literally zero emissions, not just reduced emissions, but zero emissions. And HS2 is going to last for another decade or more, so no great surprise that they are looking beyond the current situation. And all of which kind of makes me, it brought to mind the term legacy. In the preparations for the London 2012 Olympics, there was a lot of talk about the word legacy. What would be left after the demolition and construction works were completed? Well, in the case of the London 2012 Olympics, Stratford, which was the basic hub of the London 2012 Olympics, was in a very run-down, long-deprived area of East London. Because of the London 2012 Olympics, the whole of that area was rejuvenated. It's now got an absolutely vast shopping centre. It's got an aquatic centre which was used to host the swimming events. Fairly sure it's got a velodrome as well, which was used to host the cycling events, and of course, you know, the hub of the hub was the Olympic Stadium, which is now home to my beloved West Ham, and despite the fact that I still miss our old ground down at Green Street and the bowling ground, it was well past its sell by date, and I have to grudgingly admit that the new one is much, much better. So I think in terms of actual tangible legacy, I think the legacy from London 2012 is there for all to see. I mean, you can literally visit some of the buildings and the infrastructure that was erected. But I also think, and I think I'm thinking more specifically now of HS2, there will be a legacy that will be partly invisible. So there will come a time in the history and the story of HS2 where people will be able to travel to from London to the north faster. There will be more capacity on the trains, because that's basically the reason for the development of HS2. So there will be this London to Birmingham, and then Birmingham onwards up to the north of England. There will be this huge railway network that we will be able to see, and you'll be able to physically touch it and use it, and you know, people in the UK or visitors to the UK will be able to enjoy the benefits of HS2. But there will be other unseen benefits, and those unseen benefits, as I've said there about the studies that are being done into the use of non-fossil fuels and zero emissions fuels, that will be the lasting legacy. Because certainly in my experience, projects like HS2, the Channel Tunnel, London 2012, Crossrail, take the existing construction systems, methodologies, technology, and they move it along. Now, that will not always stick. As I said, with London 2012, there was an awful lot of work done to prevent theft. It didn't become a universal thing, but I think it gave everybody a flavour of what the industry would look like if machines and equipment were better protected. And nobody took anti-theft devices off their machines once that job was done. So all of those rental companies and plant hire companies and main contractors that had equipment on the London 2012 sites, and they had additional anti-theft equipment on them, those anti-theft systems remained, and they became effectively a standard. I'm expecting exactly the same thing with HS2. It will not be, HS2 will not drag the entire industry onto non-fossil zero emissions fuels overnight. No way. But we're losing red diesel benefits in April next year. So there is no question that red diesel is going away. Obviously, manufacturers like the JCBs and the Volvos of this world are working very, very hard on electric machines and on hydrogen fueled machines, all of which is that bit further away. What a project like HS2 will do is it will lay the groundwork. So they will do, as they've got this benefit of having an environmental sciences department and a team there, they will lay the groundwork for others to follow. So they as I say, they've already checked out nitrogen dioxide and particle emissions on red diesel with additives, HVO fuels with additives, and probably several other fuel sources as well. All of that will filter down and percolate down to the wider industry. So by the time HS2 is in full flight, or possibly by the time that HS2 actually finishes, the chances are that a lot of the learning curve that HS2 has gone through will then be handed down to the wider demolition and construction industry. Now, I've just mentioned the word demolition, and the reason I do that, obviously this is Demolition News. It's the Demolition News channel, so that is it tends to be my primary interest on a day-to-day basis. When we're talking about things like HS2 and the Channel Tunnel and London 2012 and Crossrail, there was a big involvement on all of those from the demolition industry. Here in the UK, we live on an island, we have finite resources, so in the main, anything new that needs to be built requires something old to be removed, and that's where the demolition industry comes in. But I think there is a differentiator a differentiator here in that whereas I mean, certainly the job with HS2 testing these various fuels is being done jointly by HS2 Limited, but also by Balfour Beatty and Vinci, which are one of the joint venture companies that are actually building the HS2 rail. We don't necessarily have that in the demolition industry. But what we do have, and what I've seen firsthand, is when the demolition industry butts up against another industry sector with perhaps greater focus on safety or the environment. And I'm thinking specifically, I mean, a couple of instances actually. I've been on sites with the likes of Erith here in the UK, who have worked very, very closely with the various rail companies. And rail companies have their own sets of standards, from the very, very simplistic, the fact that all PPE on rail is orange. That's a minor thing, but they've also got lots of other health and safety systems. In order to win work on trackside and over track demolition works, the likes of Erith have had to up their game in terms of safety. They've had to adopt some of the systems and solutions that are in place in the rail industry and make that a part of their standard operations on a day-to-day basis. I think more specifically with Erith have done quite a bit of work, and when I say Erith, I will also include in this Brown and Mason, Keltbray, Demolition Services. They've been working on power stations, and the energy companies once again have very specific and very high standards of health and safety. So once again, all of those contractors and all of the contractors that worked alongside them have had to raise their game to meet not just the modern needs of the demolition industry, but the needs of a completely separate industry. And I think perhaps the biggest example is where we've had companies working alongside maybe the nuclear industry. Which is probably the most exacting industry sector in the entire world for obvious reasons. So we've had a generation of demolition contractors who have satisfied all of the known and the coming legislation on health and safety, but then they've raised it even further to meet the legislation and health and safety requirements of an entirely separate company, an entirely separate industry rather. So as a result, you've got teams of people at the likes of Keltbray, Brown and Mason, Erith, Demolition Services. All of these companies have now had that learning experience with power stations and the nuclear industry, which they can then feed back into their main line of business. Because one of the great things about that kind of work is it's not constant. So you'll have a team of people, and I'm going to use Erith as an example. Erith have had in place for some years a team that is dedicated to all things power station related. But power stations aren't generally constant work. There's one to be done and then maybe there's a gap. Well, those people aren't then rendered unemployed. They go back into the main demolition team at Erith, and they can then cross-pollinate the information and the systems that they've learned working with power stations can then be applied to general demolition, so taking down a tower block, taking down a bridge, whatever it might be. So you're now getting a situation where you've got I guess methodologies and safety systems that you've learned working in exacting industries like power generation or nuclear power, and you're now applying that possibly even to the demolition of a house, possibly. All of which is that it goes back to what I was saying earlier. It is part of a legacy. It is taking a project, learning from it, and then taking those learnings forward. And as I say, a lot of that will be unseen. By the time HS2 actually is delivered, we'll have hundreds of miles of rail network that will make travel in the UK that much easier and that much faster. But there will be an unseen benefit, and that unseen benefit will be lower emissions on construction sites. I think better trained people, more people, because there is another part of that legacy. HS2 reported recently that in the first year of of operation, it had created 20,000 new jobs. And all those 20,000 new jobs have required some form of training. Some of it will be low level, so just making people ready to actually go on site and to, to make them ready for, the first step of the ladder in the construction industry. But there will be more, and there will be ongoing. Training is an ongoing process in the construction industry. So they might have started with just a competence card that allows them onto the site, but they can then go to, the next level up, operative, manager, project manager, and so on down the line. So that's 20,000 jobs and 20,000 skilled people in 1 year that HS2 will have created, which is, if there is no other legacy, that will be a fantastic one. Obviously, as I mentioned in the last episode of this No Agenda show, that's only a tiny fraction of what we actually need. We've got a situation in the UK here now where we are faced with an incoming glut of work from the infrastructure sector, which is, it's estimated it's going to be £650 billion spent on UK infrastructure over the next decade, and that is going to require an estimated 425,000 people a year. The fact that HS2 has created 20,000 in a year is an astonishing achievement, but we've now got to do roughly 20 times that many within the next 3 years for the start of that infrastructure spend. I'm not entirely sure where they're going to come from. I based on previous experience, and we're very bad at attracting people into the industry. I don't know what needs to change to make that better, but something does need to give. But regardless of what happens with all of that, we are going to end up with a legacy, and that legacy for HS2 is going to be a better rail network, which is fantastic. We're going to have easier travel in the UK, also fantastic. We're going to have lower emissions on construction and demolition standards using proven technology. This is not just something that's been created in a laboratory or assured by a manufacturer. This has been tried and tested in real life conditions on real life and very, very demanding sites. So that will be a major step forward. And then the other part of the legacy is going to be those additional people that are skilled, experienced, trained, and that have actually they've actually experienced construction and demolition firsthand. And it's impossible to overstate the importance of that, I think. I'm going to go off at a slight tangent now. Tomorrow night at 6 o'clock on our Diggers and Dozers Facebook page and YouTube page, we're launching a new show called the Site Equipment Show, which is going to be, as the name suggests, a show dedicated to site equipment. The reason I've called it the Site Equipment Show is back in the day here in the UK, we had an exhibition called the Site Equipment Demonstration, or SED as it was known by those that visited it. I was very fortunate in that I started in the construction industry, or writing about construction, I think it was 1987, 88. And one of the first jobs that I had was to report on an SED. So I went from writing about hotels and restaurants, bizarrely, to joining a construction magazine and then visiting this astonishing display of not just equipment, but equipment working, so that, there were lots of working demonstrations, so you could see diggers digging and dumpers dumping and dozers pushing and all the things that go with it. And before that SED, as far as I was concerned, I was always destined to be a journalist. That was what I had set in my mind as a career path. But I had no real notion of what I planned to write about. But I came away from that SED hooked. Absolutely hooked, and here we are 33 odd years later, and I'm still writing about, talking about, broadcasting about all things demolition and construction, which brings us back to the point of our biggest challenge, I think, with attracting people to the industry is attracting them in the first place. But that's all we need to do, because I genuinely think that once you've done that, once you've actually got people onto a site and got them to see and experience construction and demolition equipment up close and personal, so they can smell the diesel and they can hear the squeak of the tracks, and they can see the power of these machines. I think they're hooked. Interestingly enough, I mean, my son, who is usually behind the camera when I'm doing these things, he went to university to study music technology. He's a keen guitarist, keen musician, but he helped me out with some video work, which he seemed to enjoy. He's a much better cameraman than I am, so he did quite a bit of work with that. He did some video editing for me, and then I took him onto a site. And from the moment I took him on site, he, like me, was hooked. And now that's where he's at his best. Show him a demolition site, and give him a camera, and that's when he's at his happiest. If you tune into tomorrow's show, funnily enough, tomorrow night's show, Side Equipment Show, which is 6 p.m. UK time, you will actually see one of his films, which we shot with the good people at Rye Group. Rye Group have just switched over to HVO fuels. They've gone all in on HVO fuels. They've got a new fleet of, I can't remember if it's 3 or 4 new Caterpillar excavators, demolition spec excavators they've added to their fleet, all of which are now running on HVO fuel. And there's a film that is part of our show tomorrow night, as I say, 6 o'clock UK time, on the Facebook page of Diggers and Dozers and the YouTube page of Diggers and Dozers as well.